Here is a question most people have stopped asking because they think they already know the answer. Why is America at war with Iran? Ask the White House and you get nuclear weapons. Ask the Pentagon and you get missiles. Ask Secretary of State Rubio and you get imminent threats. Ask Trump himself on a different day and you get regime change, proxy armies, 47 years of grievances, and oil tankers, sometimes all in the same speech. 5 weeks into this war, the official reasons have shifted so many times that even America's own senators can't keep track. Democratic Senator Mark Warner put it bluntly. The Trump administration has offered, from day one, what he called a moving target of justifications for this war of choice. So let's slow down. Let's ignore the press conferences. Let's ignore the talking points. And let's ask the one question that actually matters. What was really going on? And who actually needed this war to happen? The story they started with. When the bombs fell on Iran on February 28, 2026, Trump went on television and gave the American people a reason: nuclear weapons. Iran, he said, had rejected every opportunity to give up its nuclear ambitions, and America couldn't take it anymore. And here's the thing, the underlying concern was real. Iran had entered 2026 with 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, enough material, if further enriched, for as many as 10 nuclear weapons. That's a number that should alarm anyone, and the US government knew it. But then Trump said something that accidentally contradicted his own argument. In the same speech, he reminded the world that US strikes back in June 2025 had, his words, totally obliterated Iran's nuclear program, completely destroyed, rubble. So which is it? Was the nuclear program obliterated, or was it an imminent threat that required another war? Some of the president's claims, that Iran was right at the doorstep of a nuclear weapon and that it might soon have had a missile that could hit the US mainland, conflicted with US and Western intelligence assessments. In fact, the Defense Intelligence Agency had reported that Iran could develop a militarily viable intercontinental ballistic missile by 2035, should Tehran decide to pursue the capability. In other words, nearly a decade away. And then there's the UN nuclear watchdog. Rafael Grossi, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, stated clearly that there has been no evidence of Iran building a nuclear bomb, though he acknowledged that Iran's large stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium and refusal to grant inspectors full access were cause for serious concern. Even Trump's own Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, told Congress that Iran was not in a position to build a nuclear bomb. So the nuclear story is real enough to sound credible, but it's full of holes large enough to fly a B-2 bomber through. Which brings us to a far more uncomfortable question. If the nuclear threat was being overstated, what was the actual reason? The conversation that nobody wants to talk about. Here is the fact that should stop you cold. The bombs fell on February 28th. But on February 25th, 3 days earlier, Iran's foreign minister announced that a historic agreement with the United States was, in his own words, within reach. And on February 26th, 2 days before the strikes, Oman's foreign minister, the chief mediator in the talks, announced that Iran had agreed to zero stockpiling of enriched uranium. Tehran would give up its enriched uranium entirely, downblend all previously enriched material to a neutral level, and submit to full and comprehensive IAEA verification. The Omani mediator called these terms as consequential as the 2015 Obama nuclear deal, and possibly stronger. Talks were scheduled for March 2nd. They never happened, after the US and Israel attacked Iran. Oman's foreign minister said he was dismayed that active and serious negotiations had been undermined. Now pause on that for a moment. The neutral mediator, the country sitting in the room with both sides, said a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had offered more than America had publicly asked for. And 2 days later, the bombs fell. The US version of events, delivered by envoy Steve Witkoff, was the opposite. Iran was threatening, stalling, operating in bad faith. The talks had failed. Two completely different accounts of the same conversation, and a war started in the gap between them. Before the strikes, Trump and his top officials overstated Iran's capabilities to attack the US and just how close Tehran was from developing a nuclear weapon, sources told CNN. Then, after the initial wave of strikes, administration officials said that the US acted in response to potential preemptive attacks by Iran on forces in the region, claims that were contradicted in Pentagon briefings. At this point, a reasonable person starts asking a different question entirely. Not why did the talks fail, but who needed them to fail? Israel's calculation. To understand what happened, you have to understand that Israel didn't stumble into this war. Israel engineered the conditions for it over years. Iran is not just a political rival to Israel, it is the architect of the entire network of forces surrounding Israel on every side. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. These groups exist, funded and armed by Tehran, to create permanent military pressure on Israel from multiple directions simultaneously. After October 7, 2023, Israel spent 2 years dismantling that network piece by piece. Hezbollah's entire leadership was eliminated, Hamas was devastated, the Houthis were weakened, and then Israel turned to the source. Netanyahu told Trump in February 2026 that it was impossible to make a good deal with Iran, and that even if a deal was made, Iran would not abide by it. This is Netanyahu's consistent position going back years, not months. He stood at the United Nations in 2012 with a cartoon bomb warning the world. He has been pushing for American military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure since at least that moment. And with Trump back in office, a president whose instincts aligned perfectly with Netanyahu's conclusion, the window finally opened. Some analysts said the Trump administration was convinced to go to war by Netanyahu, who has been seeking U.S. military intervention in Iran for decades. They said Trump was buoyed by a swift U.S. military operation in Venezuela and did not think through Iran's strengths before going into the war. But there is a third player in this story, and this one is the most revealing of all: the private phone calls. In the days after the war began, the Washington Post published a report that most channels buried. President Trump launched the wide-ranging attack on Iran after a weeks-long lobbying effort by an unusual pair of U.S. allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the country that publicly told the world it wanted diplomacy, the country that had signed a Chinese-brokered normalization deal with Iran just 3 years earlier, the country whose foreign minister was telling every microphone he could find that peace was the priority. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made multiple private phone calls to Trump over the past month, advocating a U.S. attack, despite his public support for a diplomatic solution. Why would a country say one thing publicly and do the complete opposite privately? Because Saudi Arabia and Iran are locked in one of the oldest and most consequential rivalries on earth. Saudi Arabia leads the Sunni Muslim world. Iran leads the Shia Muslim world. They have fought proxy wars across Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq for a generation. Iran's growing military capability was not just a regional irritant to Riyadh, it was a direct threat to the Vision 2030 transformation that MBS has staked his entire legacy on. A nuclear-capable Iran changes the entire power balance of the Middle East in ways that Saudi Arabia cannot afford. And then there is the financial layer underneath all of this. The Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund is the largest investor in Jared Kushner's private equity firm Affinity Partners, having invested $2 billion, even though the PIF's own internal committee recommended rejecting the proposal, citing inexperience and excessive fees. That recommendation was overruled by MBS himself. Kushner was then placed by Trump as a senior negotiator in the Iran nuclear talks, the exact talks that collapsed just before the bombs fell. The UAE, another country that lobbied Trump to strike Iran, directly invested about $200 million with Kushner's firm, with additional government-linked funds from Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth sources. The UAE's national security advisor purchased 49% of a crypto company co-founded by Trump's Middle East envoy just days before Trump's inauguration. Saudi Arabia denied the Washington Post's reporting, and some analysts argue MBS had real reasons to avoid this war. Iranian retaliatory strikes on Saudi oil infrastructure were entirely predictable and damaging. The full truth of those private phone calls may never be fully public. But here is what is documented, confirmed, and sitting in plain sight. The people lobbying for this war had deep financial relationships with the people who decided to start it. The neutral mediator says the talks were succeeding. America's own intelligence said Iran posed no imminent threat to the U.S. mainland for nearly a decade. And the justifications for the war have shifted so many times that even the administration's own officials can't agree on what they are. Trump administration officials have offered diverse and changing explanations for starting the war: to preempt Iranian retaliation after an expected Israeli attack, to ward off an imminent Iranian threat, to destroy Iran's missile capabilities, to prevent Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon, to secure Iran's natural resources, and to achieve regime change. That is 6 different reasons for one war from the same administration. What does this mean for you? Here's the reality. Nobody in power wants to say clearly. This war was launched without congressional approval, without a serious public debate, and in the face of a diplomatic process that independent observers say was producing real results. The people paying the price are not the decision makers. They are ordinary Iranians living through bombardment. They are workers across Asia, Africa, and Europe watching food and fuel prices climb because a 21-mile strait is now closed. They are American families paying over $4 a gallon at the pump, the highest since 2022. And the men who made the phone calls, signed the investment deals, and flew to Saudi Arabia to bring people on board, they are watching from a distance. Wars almost never have one cause. They are always the product of overlapping interests that align at exactly the right moment. A country that sees a window, an ally that has been waiting decades for this exact opportunity, financial relationships that create incentives nobody will admit to publicly, and a negotiating process that someone needed to fail. You were told this war was about nuclear weapons. The evidence says the answer is considerably more complicated than that. That is what this channel exists to tell you. Subscribe because the deeper story of every major conflict is always the one they hope you stop looking for.